I have a playlist that talks about ego illusions. And in this playlist, I'm going to talk about ego games. And if you want to get the full benefit from this playlist about the ego games, you need to have watched the ego illusions videos, because they set the foundation that I'm going to build on in this one. So we can put it this way, that the ego illusions form like a veil over our minds. And the ego games are designed to keep us trapped in that veil, to prevent us from seeing through the veil. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to use three examples, or three symbols, symbolic explanations for it. And the first one is the old fairy tale about the Sleeping Beauty. So if you remember this from a child, the idea is that there's this princess living in a castle, and when she was born, there was a prophecy that at her 18th birthday, she would prick her finger and fall asleep. Or rather, I think the original prophecy was she would die, but then it got mitigated by a fairy godmother that she would only fall asleep. Anyway, this is a symbol for what happens to us when we are blinded by the ego. Now, I have talked about how there are 144 levels of consciousness. And when we first take embodiment on Earth, we start at the 48th level, where we have some sense of being connected to our higher selves. And what happens is that when we go below the 48th level, we go into duality, use the duality consciousness to create the impression that we are separate beings. That's a symbol for the princess falling asleep. In other words, the conscious you is the princess who falls asleep. And you could say it's not exactly the way the fairy tale is, because the conscious you isn't actually asleep in the sense that it can't do anything. It is awake and it is experiencing, but there's a veil over the mind of the conscious you, and that's the ego that has created this with all these ego illusions. And so in the fairy tale, the story is that after everybody in the court falls asleep, a thick hedge of thorny bushes grows up around the castle and hides the castle. And that's a symbol for the ego's constructions in the subconscious mind, what I've called these subconscious selves. So the ego doesn't put the conscious you to sleep in the sense that it isn't living, it isn't doing anything. But the ego creates this veil, and now the conscious you is seeing through the veil. And therefore it's making decisions based on this. And this is what creates all of these subconscious cells, where we sort of dig a deeper and deeper hole for ourselves, like more and more thorny bushes spring up. So the fairy tale is that after 100 years, a prince comes by, he hears the story of this beautiful princess in the castle, and he decides to take out a sword and chop down all of these thorny bushes, or not all of them, but enough that he can get through, kisses the princess, he wakes up, and they live happily ever after. And this is, of course, where the fairy tale becomes not very useful, because it isn't that way in reality. But there's still some symbolic value in it, in the sense that when the conscious you has fallen asleep behind all of the thorny bushes created by the ego, you can't free yourself from it. Because, as I've explained in many of my non-duality videos, your mind becomes a closed system. And you simply can't see that there's anything outside the veil of illusions created by the ego. So you do need something from outside your own mind, and that is what I have called the one mind, or the Christ mind. So I've also explained that you can go from the 48th level, you can go below, and you can go to the very lowest level that's possible on Earth. But no matter how low you go, the one mind is always there for you. Now, this doesn't mean that the one mind is going to show you the ultimate truth. It's going to show you what corresponds to your current level of consciousness. In other words, you're at a certain level of consciousness. Say you're at the 24th level. there's a certain illusion associated with that level. And that's what the Christ mind will show you, the reality beyond that illusion. So you can see it's an illusion, and therefore you can make the decision to let it go. And of course, once you see an illusion at a certain level, it allows you, if you use it, to go to the next level up to the 25th level. Then if you again reach for the Christ, you can see the next illusion, you can go to the 26th, and you can keep going. And that's why, in the fairy tale, if the fairy tale was accurate, the prince should penetrate, awaken the princess, but then she would have to go out and chop down all the thorny bushes representing these subconscious selves that we all have to overcome. The conscious you has to overcome these subconscious selves created below that level of the 48th level, where you are into separation. Now, let's shift a little bit to another analogy, and it's a spiral staircase. So what actually happens is, you could say, you start at the 48th level, but then you go below. You make the decision to experiment with a duality consciousness, and it seems like a fairly innocent decision. But the problem is that you are now going down the spiral staircase, but you don't necessarily notice you're going down. And this is what is actually important to realize. You could say, why are you going down the staircase? Why do you decide to go into duality? And it's because there comes a point where the conscious you doesn't really want to make decisions. Now, this can be because, as I've explained in my avatar videos, that you are exposed to this very traumatic event here on Earth. And as a result of this trauma, you decide, well, it seems like I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't, so I want to do as little as possible. So often it's because of this, and as I've explained in my video about how the world was created, there are some beings that are allowed to embody on Earth that are called fallen beings that are often exposing us to these traumas. They are the ones who created all of the major conflicts on Earth. So we've all been exposed to these traumas. And so what happens is we come to a point where we really don't want to make decisions. And so what happens is it can be compared to, now instead of standing up on the staircase, you are lying down. And you can imagine if you're lying down on a staircase, you can very easily slide down. And you don't really notice it as much because it's not as bumpy as if you're taking one step at a time. And which step are you sliding down? The one under your feet, the one under your head? You see what I'm saying? It becomes more of a gradual slide down. You just keep sliding down. You don't really notice you're going down, but all of a sudden you've gone around a bend in the staircase. Now you can no longer see the top. And you just keep sliding down. And so what causes us to start this slide is, as I said, the conscious you decides, I don't really want to make decisions, or I don't really want to be here, or I don't really want to deal with life. You're somehow making that decision. And that decision we can call a death decision. It's actually what Jesus talked about 2,000 years ago. There's a situation where a young man comes to Jesus and basically says, I'd like to follow you, Master, but please allow me to first go and bury my dead father. The father has just died. And Jesus turns to him rather sternly and says, let the dead bury their dead. And if you think about this logically, it obviously makes no sense, because the people who are burying the dead father are not physically dead, right? But what Jesus means is that they are dead in consciousness, in the sense that they have gone into this, what I call the duality consciousness, but which Jesus 2,000 years ago called the death consciousness. In other words, they are behind the veil of the ego. And therefore, from a spiritual sense, they are dead. That's also why Jesus said that unless you're willing to lose your life for my sake, in other words, in order to follow the Christ, you can't attain eternal life, because you're going to stay in that artificial sense of identity. So it's not that you are dead in a physical sense, but you're dead in a spiritual sense, because you have now created a sense of identity where you see yourself as a separate being. And life, in Jesus' terminology, is the one mind, the Christ consciousness. And without the Christ consciousness, you have no life in you, spiritually speaking. And so this is what Jesus meant, with the death consciousness. And so you have to, as I said, you have to recognize that the Christ comes there to give you whatever you need at your current level to take that next step up. So we can say, going down the staircase or deciding that you're not willing to make decisions, that's a death decision. But when you recognize the Christ and decide to go up the staircase, that's a life decision. The trick is, you can slide down gradually without really noticing it, but you can't slide back up. You have to stand up, take a stand for yourself, make this, we might call it the ultimate life decision. Yes, I am willing to stand up, I'm willing to take responsibility for myself, for my growth. And then you look for the Christ, you see the illusion, you let go of that self, and you take one distinct step up. And then you look for the next illusion, you take the next distinct step up. You see what I'm saying? When you take death decisions, you can gradually slide down the staircase without noticing. But if you want to walk the spiritual path, you have to stand up for yourself and take distinct, discrete decisions up the staircase. And the Christ is there at every step of the way. You have to understand, you don't have to make these decisions alone. You can make them based on the Christ mind, with a connection to the Christ mind. And of course, you don't have to see through the ultimate illusion all at once. You just see through the illusion at your current level, take the next step up, you see the illusion at that level, take the next step, and there's always the Christ mind there to show you the illusion you're dealing with right now. So it's a doable path. Okay, so let's take another analogy. The conscious you can be compared to a person who started his own company. And so he's the owner of the company. But the company becomes so big, and at some point he desires to hire a CEO to oversee the daily running of the company. And the owner, he kind of semi-retires a little bit. He has a nice house in the country, he has a country club, he goes there and plays golf. And so he's just sort of enjoying life while the CEO is running the company. And this is comparable to what happens when you go below the 48th level and you create the ego based on separation. The ego is like the CEO who's running the daily business of your life. So you, the conscious you can withdraw. And you're not involved with the day-to-day business. This is comparable to what I've said. You have all these subconscious cells in your subconscious mind. And it's like the program for riding a bicycle. You may not have ridden a bicycle for many years, but once you get on a bicycle, the program is activated and now you can ride it without thinking about it. And it's the same with all of the other programs we have for how you respond to daily life. You have a certain situation that comes up, it triggers one of these subconscious cells. You're not making a conscious decision. The conscious you is not making a conscious decision how to react to that situation. You just let the subconscious self deal with it. And this essentially is also why you get deeper and deeper into a hole, because the subconscious cells, they can't make a decision based on the Christ mind. They can only make decisions based on the duality consciousness, and this always creates a problem. And eventually it creates suffering, so you experience suffering. In order to avoid that, you make another decision, takes you deeper down. So we can illustrate that by saying that for a while it seems like the owner of the company, he's doing well, the company is making money, he can focus on his country club and enjoying life. But then there comes time for the yearly report. And now the ego, or rather the CEO, comes in and says, well, we had some trouble this year, market conditions weren't very good, but if you'll just approve a loan from the bank, then we'll be much better off next year. And so the CEO, the conscious you, not the CEO, the owner, the conscious you, doesn't really want to get involved with the day-to-day of the business. He kind of trusts the CEO is going to take care of it. So he says, okay, I approve the loan. And that's a death decision, right? So you understand the ego can't make death decisions that take you down the staircase. But why did the owner make that decision to approve the loan? Based on the experience that the CEO presented to him. So the CEO says, we have a problem, and here's the solution, the easy solution to the problem. And this is the relationship between the conscious you and the ego. The conscious you has to make the death decision to go down the spiral staircase or the life decision to go up. But it allows the ego to present it with the information that it bases the decision on. Because you're seeing through this veil of all these ego illusions or these ego games. So the thing is, when you allow the ego to present you with the information, you can't really make a life decision. So you end up making a death decision, an avoidance decision, because you want to avoid taking responsibility and asking the Christ mind for the Christ perspective. So then, you approve the loan, everything seems to be going okay for another year, and then comes the next company report. Yeah, we didn't quite make it back to profitability this year because there were some difficult conditions, there was a problem here and a problem there. But you know what, it's all temporary, just approve another loan and we'll do much better next year. And if the owner still doesn't want to take responsibility, get involved with the day-to-day business, he approves the loan because he trusts the information given to him by the CEO. And that's another death decision. And that's how it goes. So the ultimate life decision, or the first decisive life decision, is to decide you are willing to take responsibility and make decisions. Again, as I said, you don't have to make these enormously complicated decisions all at once. You just have to look at your current level of consciousness, discover the illusion there, see the Christ alternative, and decide to let go of the illusion, let go of that separate self, and rise to the next level. That is a life decision. So now, ego games. What is an ego game? Well, it's basically something that the ego has created that is designed to keep you from making that life decision, to take back responsibility for making decisions. The ego is trying to keep you on this slide down where you make one decision that takes you a step down, you have a problem. In order to avoid taking responsibility for getting the Christ perspective, you make another decision that takes you down, and you just keep going down gradually. And you never get to that turning point where you say, oh, this is enough now, I've had enough of it. I'm going to look for the Christ. That's what the ego is trying to prevent. But even if you do make that decision, then the ego is going to use the ego games to try to prevent you from climbing back up. So we could say that, most of us who are spiritual people, we grew up in a non-spiritual environment. They might have been affected by a religion, or it might have been scientific materialism, but we grew up in a non-spiritual environment. And we feel that something is missing, we are looking for something. And then at some point we find the spiritual path. We find a guru, an organization, a teaching. And we say, this is what I've been looking for. And the ego was trying to do everything it could. We often don't remember this, but the ego was trying to do everything it could to prevent us from finding the spiritual path. Because when we do decide to accept that there is a path to a higher level of consciousness, this is like taking responsibility or standing up on the staircase and say, okay, I'm willing to do something that people around me aren't doing, that the people I grew up with aren't doing. I'm willing to do something different. But now the ego will do everything it can to make sure that you don't make it up the staircase. You go into a blind alley, or you get entangled on a certain step and you're standing there on that step for a very long time because you're tangled up in these ego games. And You could also look at it another way. You could say that an ego game, it's designed to keep you trapped in this separate sense of identity. Now, if you think about this, at the 48th level, you have a sense you're connected to something outside your own mind. You do not, at the 40th level, don't have a real clear sense of what it is, but you have a sense there's something outside your own mind. And so when you go below the 48th level, you go into a distinctly different sense of self, sense of identity. Because now you lose that connection. You've literally lost the connection. That's why Jesus said, you're spiritually dead when you go below the 48th level. But of course, the conscious you doesn't realize this. And it doesn't realize it because the ego is created right away and is presenting it. And, well, you could say the conscious you doesn't realize it because it's still conscious. It's not like you notice a big change. As I said, it seems like a gradual change from the perspective of the conscious you. So what happens is that now that you don't have a sense that you are more than the mind, you start thinking you are the mind. This outer mind that you are consciously aware of, this is who you are. Which means you now build a new sense of identity based on the conditions in this world. And you just see many, many people. I have met people now for 48 years on the spiritual path. And it became clear to me that at some point, actually at a fairly early point, it became clear to me that I'm a spiritual being, which means I'm not defined by anything on earth. I'm not defined by my family, by the country I grew up in, by the religion I was brought up in, by my political beliefs, my opinions about this or that. I'm not defined by any of this. But you look at many, many people, and I have met people who are on the spiritual path, and they've been on the spiritual path for decades. But they still haven't made that shift of realizing I'm a spiritual being. For example, I know people from Russia who see themselves as Russians who are walking the spiritual path. I know people from America who see themselves as Americans walking the spiritual path. Whereas I grew up in Denmark, I see myself as a spiritual being who happened to be born in Denmark, but I don't identify myself as a Dane. And of course I met both Americans and Russians who don't identify themselves based on their nationality. They see themselves as spiritual beings. But there are some people who have been on the spiritual path for a long time who haven't made that switch. And this is just an example of an ego game. The ego game is trying to get you to continue, even though you're walking the spiritual path, but you still identify yourself based on certain characteristics here on earth. It could be nationality, religion, it could be your sex, it could be your sexuality, it could be all kinds of things. So, this is in a sense, it's an example of an ego game, but I'll talk in coming talks, I'll talk more about the specific ego games. But now that I've set sort of a foundation, I'd like to talk about the one game that could be said to be the kind of like the master game or the basic game of the ego. And so we have to realize here, the slide down from the 48th level down is a gradual slide. As I said, it's like you're lying down on the spiral staircase and you're gradually sliding down. There's a little bit of bumps, but it's not like a big bump for every step. So you barely notice you're sliding down. And the ego wants to keep you sliding down. But when you find the spiritual path, you stop the slide. And now you're standing up. Maybe in the beginning you're just rolling over, lying on your knees and climbing on your knees one step at a time. But still, you're deciding you want to climb up. And so the master game of the ego is to prevent you from going to the point where you see the ego and you see the ego is not your identity, is not who you really are. In other words, it wants to prevent you from coming back up where you are connected. You again experience that connection to something outside your own mind. Because really, when it comes right down to it, and this is what I'm saying with these people who are still identified with, for example, their nationality, you can reason with these people and you can tell them, but it doesn't click. I mean, they might understand it intellectually, but it doesn't really change you until you have an experience. And this is what I've talked about several times. It's a mystical or intuitive experience. It's actually where the conscious you steps outside of the outer personality, all these subconscious selves in the 4 levels of the mind, the identity, mental, emotional, and physical. The conscious you steps outside and experiences that, oh, I'm not all of this structure. This is not really who I am. I actually can exist without this structure. I don't die if the outer self dies or if the physical body dies. I'm an immortal being. And this, of course, is what the ego wants to prevent you from doing. And the master game for doing this is that the ego defines a norm. It says, this is normal. So go back to the CEO and the owner of the business. The CEO or the owner has been happily playing golf at his country club for a year, and now they have the yearly meeting, the company report. And the CEO says, yeah, things are not going quite well, but you know, it's just the way the market is. Everybody is struggling. It's normal to be struggling. It's normal. And the owner doesn't really make the decision to get back involved with the company and make these decisions about whether it's normal or not. So he thinks, okay, yeah, he's probably right. It's just the economy this year is not good. So we'll get that loan and then next year it'll be better. You see what I'm saying? What the ego is really saying is that even though you are struggling, it's normal to be struggling. This is what the Buddha encapsulated in the First Noble Truth. Life is suffering. But he also, of course, said there's a way out of suffering. And that's what the ego will never say, and it will not want you to admit it. Because the ego will say, but look, everybody is suffering. Suffering is normal for a human being. Or it will say, look, you are Russian. This is normal for Russians. You are an American. It's normal for Americans to suffer this way. Every country suffers. You see, the ego defines there's a norm for what it means to be a human being. And you just have to follow that norm. It doesn't want you to realize or start questioning, yeah, okay, I see that all human beings are suffering. But does that mean that you have to suffer? Well, maybe human beings have to suffer. But maybe I'm not really a human being. Maybe I'm a spiritual being that didn't originate here on earth, that came from somewhere else, and that means I can connect to that reality I came from, and then maybe I can walk a path and I can gradually overcome suffering. And the ego will say, oh, no, you've totally misunderstood it. It's completely wrong. Look what everybody's saying. Just suffer, like, accept your fate. That this is normal. It's normal not to be connected. It's normal not to look at yourself and your own psychology and what the problem is in your psychology. Look for these illusions, these separate selves. It's just normal. Just keep reacting the way you normally do. Go back to your country club and relax, and then I'll run the day-to-day operations for you. And so what happens is we find a spiritual path, whatever it is for us individually. But in most spiritual teachings, we get the idea, we actually get the idea, that the state of consciousness we're in that causes suffering, this is not actually normal. There is an alternative, and it is to raise our consciousness. Usually there's a path, you have to study a teaching, you have to follow a guru, you have to practice a certain practice. But even this can be used by the ego. Because if you look at all of the spiritual organizations out there, I haven't looked at all of them. There may be an exception here or there, but I have looked at a few over my 48 years on the path, and I see the pattern in the same in all of them. An organization develops a certain culture, and it may have teachings about you're on the spiritual path, you are practicing, say you are invoking violet flame from the ascended masters, and it's going to transmute your karma. And when you're karma free, pop, you're going to ascend. Or you're meditating 20 minutes morning and evening, and after so many years you're going to be in pop again, you're going to be in cosmic consciousness. And this means that the organization develops a norm. Hello. It's no longer the human norm you were brought up with. But there's still a norm in the organization. If you keep studying the teaching, if you keep practicing the practice, pop, you'll be there. And that is an example of how the ego can use even a spiritual teaching to abort your growth. You found a spiritual path, you realize there's a higher state of consciousness, and you think that by following these outer rules and practices defined by your organization, one day, pop, you're going to get there. And therefore, not being there is normal. Not having arrived is normal. And what it means also is, you just study the outer teaching, you practice the outer practices. You don't have to look at your psychology, you don't have to look for the ego hiding. You can make it without looking at the ego. It's what I call the outer path or the automatic path. And it's a fabrication of the ego. There are also some false teachers that are promoting it. Of course, the extreme example is the fundamentalist Christians. You declare Jesus to be your Lord and Savior, and pop, he's going to come and save you. And, it can't work that way. As I've explained, free will is the ultimate reality here. You chose to go into separation and create these subconscious selves. You are not going to be able to ascend or go to the spiritual realm or go to heaven or be saved until you overcome those subconscious selves. But overcoming the subconscious selves must be a conscious process where you look at the self, look at the illusion, look how the self creates this reactionary pattern that causes you to harm yourself, and you decide to let the self die. You decide you no longer want to react this way. And this has to be a voluntary decision, which means it has to be a conscious decision, because if it ain't conscious, it can't be voluntary. And this means that you have to look at your psychology. If you don't look at your psychology, you will not escape the ego games. It can be done. If you want to be the owner who's always in the country club, playing golf and focusing on the pleasantries of life, you're not going to make it on the spiritual path. You have to get back there and say, you know what, CEO, I'm kicking you out. I'm taking over. I'm running this show. That's what you have to do. And you have to then be willing to look at each of these thorny bushes that grew up around the castle while you were sleeping. You have to chop them down, look at these separate selves, look at their illusions, let them go. It's, quite frankly, it's the only way to grow. Now, it doesn't matter what spiritual teaching you are following or organization or practice. It doesn't really matter. There are many valid spiritual teachings that can help you walk this path. You can, for that matter, you don't even have to be in a spiritual teaching. You could do it by just looking at psychology. But the reality here is, unless you look at the psychology and work on resolving it, you will not grow, no matter what. And if you don't believe me, there is only one reason. You're believing your ego instead of believing what I'm saying. You have accepted the ego's norm. Oh yeah, I can make it. Because it's normal that I can walk this path and practice this practice and study this teaching, that, oh, my guru is so special, he's enlightened, and he's telling me I can do this. So this is just normal. I don't have to look at the ego. Who is this Kim guy who's telling me I have to look at the ego? Who does he think he is? My guru is much more sophisticated, and he's telling me I just keep practicing and then I'll make it. Well, that's fine. Believe what you want to believe. I'm just telling you, unless you look at the beam in your own eye, you will not make it to the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God is within you. And the kingdom of God is your natural state. It's not really you have to do anything to get back to the kingdom. You have to stop doing all the things you're doing through the ego that pulls you away from the kingdom. Because when you get rid of all these subconscious selves, you naturally connect to your higher self. And your connection and oneness with your higher self, that's the kingdom of God. That's a higher state of consciousness. I mean, what else would there be? Just think about it. Why aren't you in a higher state of consciousness right now? Because something pulled you out of it. What pulled you out of it? The ego's illusions, the ego's games, the illusion that you are a separate being. And that illusion is made up of all of these individual selves, which is the good news, because it means you can look at one self at a time and overcome it. But you are going to have to look at all of them before you're completely free. But of course, when you get rid of some of them, you will start having that greater connection to your higher self, and suddenly the path becomes much easier, much more enjoyable. But it's still you who has to look at your psychology, and you have to keep doing this as long as you're embodiment on this planet. There's no way around it. You know, I have met people who they worked on their psychology for a while, they followed some spiritual teaching, they had these dramatic experiences, and they think, that's it, I made it. I'm awakened, I'm enlightened, whatever they call it. And, you know, it's not that I haven't had some dramatic experiences on my life where I realized I'd turn a corner, but I never really believed that that was the end of growth. Because I always somehow had in the back of my mind, if I'm still in embodiment on this very low and very dense planet, there's still something I have to look at in my psychology, because there's something that keeps me here. And what keeps you here is some kind of ego game. There's some kind of ego game that you haven't seen yet. And you haven't seen that it's not real. That it's just something the ego has created. It's a completely artificial problem. But the ego is projecting, you have to solve it. You have to be engaged in it. Just as one example, you know, obviously I'll go into in the next talk the specific ego game. So just as one example. Look at most of the people you grew up with. I suspect that there are some people in your family who have all of their lives had some quarrel with other members of your family. They argue, they fight, or they don't talk to each other. And so this is a personality clash that's been going on for all of their lives. It's probably been going on for several embodiments, because many of these relationships are what you can call karmic relationships. People keep re-embodying in the same groups over and over again until they do what Jesus said, you know, turn the other cheek, forgive 70 times 7. And so you see, when you look at Jesus, what he said, turn the other cheek, forgive, he was really telling people how to overcome one of the most common ego games, which is you're arguing with other people. And you feel it's so important you have to be right. And you can't see anything else in life. You can't really enjoy life. You're so focused on this, proving the other person wrong, being right. All of these, we might call them petty struggles that people have. And you might have been involved with this when you were younger, but if you're on the spiritual path and have been on the spiritual path, I think you have already overcome this. And so the reason I'm using it as an example is you can see you've already overcome several of these ego games. And as I talk more about it, you might see you've overcome more ego games. So it's a doable thing. It's not that it's impossible, but it can only be done by looking at yourself. Now, if you overcome this game of arguing with other people, I bet there came a point where you simply looked at this and said, I don't want to do this anymore. Why do I keep arguing? Why is it so important to be right? And this is what Jesus said to the young man. Let the dead bury their dead. You come and follow me. He also said, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. In other words, what do all of these petty games that people are playing, what do they mean to you if you have seen that there's a path to a higher state of consciousness? Then it's much more important to follow that path. And how can you follow that path? You have to be willing to lose your life, meaning not your physical life, but what you thought was your life, namely this game, that you have to be right with your family members or other people. For a while, this was your life. This was eating up your life. But there came a point where you're willing to lose it in order to follow Christ, in order to go higher on the spiral staircase. So I think as you watch the coming videos, you'll see that you've already overcome some of these ego games. Which means what? It means you can overcome all of them. If you overcome one, you can overcome all. You just need to come to see that this is not normal behavior. This is an ego game. And it's designed to keep you trapped and prevent you from taking the next step up on the path. So I look forward to sharing these coming ego games with you. It's of course not something I have figured out myself. It's actually based on this book, Freedom from Ego Games, which was dictated to me by Jesus quite a number of years ago, actually. And a lot of people have found it very helpful in coming to understand the ego. So I hope you'll find the coming talks useful, and it'll help you really take a giant leap forward on your spiritual path.